Nou ja, soos ek vroeër genoem het, ons bespreek vanoggend 'n redelike gewigtige onderwerp, want ons fokus vanoggend op die impak van geslagsgeweld, so aan die einde van die 16 dae van aktivisme teen geweld teen vroue en kinders. En ons verwelkom vir Dr. Alicia Porter. So good morning, Dr. Alicia, and thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning. It's so good to be here on this very fresh Friday morning.
Now, I would like to start with this challenge in our country specifically, because, I mean, when you take a look at the president and the fact that he usually refers to this as a problem, it seems like it's only increasing. What is your opinion or your take on that?
There definitely has been an increase in gender-based violence since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. They're actually now calling it, the United Nations is calling it the shadow pandemic. Just as an example, before the COVID pandemic, there was globally about 240 million cases of gender-based violence reported globally. And this has intensified since the pandemic. Just in the first month of lockdown here in South Africa, the calls to particularly the domestic violence helplines increased by 69%. So we really are dealing with a second pandemic, a shadow pandemic that has really intensified.
Absolutely. Now, you are a psychiatrist, and I would like to refer to some of the most common reasons behind this challenge and problem in the country and actually worldwide for that matter.
I mean, you know, with COVID and the restrictions that were imposed secondary to the pandemic, we found that victims were then in close proximity to perpetrators, so that definitely increased the incidents or increased the reports, but also just the challenges of the pandemic, school closures, remote learning, working from home, the financial stresses that the pandemic has, brought about, the increased worries about security, job safety, just being in cramped spaces. Also, there's more sort of spaces in communities where there's no people because of these lockdown measures. So just coping with this unprecedented change has definitely intensified or made the problem even worse than it was, because it wasn't that it wasn't a problem pre the pandemic. We had a problem. We've just had an intensification of the problem.
And now when you go back to the roots of this problem as well, I think that something that really comes to mind is socio-economic circumstances. And also, you know, the lack of male role models. What would you say about that? Do you agree?
I think, yes, that definitely contributes. So socioeconomics, yes, but it's not just socioeconomic, because I think we see gender-based violence across the board, but definitely more common where, in terms of socioeconomics. And yes, a lack of male role models, because, children learn by modeling, they learn by what they see. And so a lack of this definitely does perpetuate the problem. And our solutions need to be beyond just the individual, helping the individual. We've got to collaborate, because even education needs to come on board, because we need to begin teaching boys, about nonviolence, teaching them how to manage their emotions and all of those things. So definitely, I 100% agree that it's multifaceted as well.
Now, like you've said, I mean, this was a huge problem before the pandemic, but is there anything else that you would like to add regarding the impact of COVID-19 on this challenge?
I mean, it definitely has impacted the mental health of victims who are exposed to violence, because what we do know is that there's definitely an increase in post-traumatic stress. there's an increase in anxiety, there's an increase in depression. Also, victims who are exposed to violence are at a greater risk of attempting suicide. And so not just the physical aspects of gender-based violence, but the mental health consequences, the mental health impact, those are far-reaching, and long after, the physical has been attended to, the mental health consequences are long-lasting. And, in terms of our resources in mental health, we're already experiencing, difficulties with resources, and more so now with this particular, with gender-based violence. In particular, the mental health burden is really intense.
Now, I mean, there's still a lot of questions that I have for you, and I'm sure we'll discuss it after the 7 o'clock news. But I would also like to ask you, I mean, and it's just from a personal point of view, when taking a look at the news and the fact that, you constantly read about these kind of cases, do you sometimes feel that you're losing hope within this regard?
I mean, yes, because the problem is it's all over, it's increased, it's intensified. But, we always think back that as a nation, as South Africans, we are resilient. And we, even in the face of multiple adversities, we've had an ability to bounce back. And so, it's been so encouraging where during COVID, there have been so many more NGOs and civil society that have come on board, to collaborate with governments with regards to fighting gender-based violence, raising awareness. I listened to a lady in the Cape yesterday saying that they've worked around the clock as an NGO to provide shelter and counseling to victims of gender-based violence. So while we have a problem, we also have solutions. And I think as South Africans, we have an ability, and we have been creative in, finding solutions to problems. So
now,
problems
apologies.
sometimes feels quite hopeless.
Apologies from my side, but we'll continue with this point of view right after the 7 o'clock news. So please stay tuned. Jy kan ingeskakel bly vir die res van hierdie gesprek. Ons gaan nou voort met vanoggend se baie gewigtige onderwerp. Ons kyk na die impak van geslagsgeweld so aan die einde van die 16 dae van aktivisme teen geweld teen vroue en kinders. En Dr. Alicia Porter gesels steeds saam. So once again, I would just like to thank you for joining us this morning, Dr. Alicia.
It's good to be here.
Now, we've been discussing the impact of, awareness within this regard, and you were busy explaining, and you've referred to a case that you've recently kind of had to do with. So can you just please elaborate a little bit more and continue with that point that you were trying to make?
So I was saying that although we see so much, in the media about gender-based violence, there is a lot that is being done by the NGOs and civil society in terms of fighting gender-based violence, raising awareness, and the shelters that have come up since COVID. They have really come up at an amazing rate. And so there is a lot that is being done by, the average South African. As I say, there was a lady that I spoke to yesterday who was saying that they've worked around the clock to assist victims on helplines and in shelters and on, telephone calls. And so while the situation appears hopeless, there is still people out there who are doing their best to assist in this regard.
Now, when taking a look at something such as awareness, do you think that it's successful, and what more can be done to fight this challenge?
I mean, the thing about it is that it should be at multiple levels. So it's not just the individual. It should be at an individual level. So we need to empower and raise awareness within the individual victims, but also just at community level. You know, we hear numerous stories of incidents that happen in the community where people were afraid to get involved. They wouldn't even call the police. You know, we need to be creating these safe spaces within communities because that's where people live. That's where this is happening. But also not just individual and communities, but, you know, institutions. There needs to be collaboration with government and government agencies like the police, the justice, because it's one thing when a charge has been laid, but how does a victim get justice for what may have been done? And also just things like, you know, within the justice system, how do we get in terms of the cost to the perpetrators? They need to be involved in programs and, you know, those kind of things. But also just at a policy level, there needs to be an intervention. But it's about a multi-stakeholder collaboration and how do we then get a coordinated response? I think awareness is one aspect of fighting, because I think if we are unaware or we don't acknowledge that this is a problem, we're not aware that this is a problem, then it becomes difficult to do anything, you know, beyond that. So I think it really is at multiple levels and we need collaboration.
Absolutely. Now, Dr. Alicia, I mean, I think one of the main problems is the fact that there are quite often cases where the victim knows the criminal, whether a boyfriend, a fiancé, a husband, family member, or a friend. And I wish we had more time to, you know, continue with this discussion. But what would you like to hear from our president, especially since he's referring to this as another pandemic?
You know, I would like to hear how we're going to collaborate. You know, how does the government agencies, in terms of even just the police, you know, there's often stories, and this is no sort of slight on the police, but you know, we often hear stories of how victims are handled, how their cases are handled. And so we need training, we need upskilling in that regard. So even within the justice system, how do we ensure that justice ensues? You know, what are the policies that need to be put in place? Because oftentimes, you know, victims then will drop the charges against a perpetrator, and then they, you know, continue going on. So we need strengthening within our policies, strengthening within our institutional responses. And so it really is, how do we empower and how do we strengthen the system?
Well, thank you so much for everything that you've actually discussed and, you know, also for the insight that you've shared with us this morning.
Thank you very much.